The moment I opened the door to my mountain lodge, I knew something was wrong. The air inside smelled different. Perfume, cooked food, and something else I couldn't quite place. Comfort. But not my comfort. The faint echo of laughter drifted from the living room, followed by a voice I recognized instantly. My son, Jason. Only, he wasn't supposed to be there. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. The lodge was my private escape, a place even my family rarely visited. As I stepped further in, the scene unfolded like a bad dream. My son sat sprawled on the couch, beer in hand, while his wife, Erica, and her parents lounged around like they owned the place. There were bags, clothes, and even decorations that weren't mine. My family photos had been replaced with their pictures. The audacity hit me like a punch to the chest. For a second, no one noticed me standing there, frozen in the doorway. Then Erica's mother spotted me. "Oh, you must be Mr. Harlow," she said, her tone bright and falsely polite. "We didn't expect you so soon." Jason turned, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't planned on me finding out. "Dad, I, didn't think you were coming this weekend," he stammered. "Clearly," I said coldly, setting my keys on the counter. "Seems like you made yourselves right at home." Erica smiled thinly. "Jason said you weren't using the lodge much anymore, so we thought, why let it sit empty?" The nerve of her made my blood boil. This lodge had been my sanctuary for over 20 years, the one place I could breathe since my wife passed. Every inch of it held her memory. The scent of her lavender candles, the soft blankets she used to knit by the fire, even the creak in the old wooden floor that she always complained about. And now, strangers, my own sons-in-laws, were sitting on her favorite couch, drinking from her mugs, laughing under her roof. I didn't explode. Not yet. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate breath and said, "I see. Well, I wouldn't want to intrude." The tension in the room shifted. They couldn't tell if I was being sarcastic or sincere. I gave Jason one long look before retreating to the small study in the back of the cabin. It still smelled like pine and old paper, untouched, unspoiled. I closed the door, sat down at my desk, and smiled to myself. They thought they could take advantage of me. They thought the old man who gave them everything, the tuition, the down payment on their house, the business loan, was too soft to stand up for himself. But they had forgotten one thing. I built everything I had from nothing. I'd lost my wife, yes, but I hadn't lost my will. And if they wanted to play with what was mine, then they were about to learn what a Harlow's revenge really looked like. That night, I stayed silent, watching them through the reflection of the window as they laughed and drank. I heard Erica whisper to her mother, "He'll come around. He always does. He can't say no to Jason." I smiled into my glass of scotch. They had no idea that the next time they'd step into this cabin, the locks would be changed, their clothes gone, and their name nowhere in the deed. They had moved into my home thinking it was their right, but they were about to learn that every comfort they had stolen was borrowed time. I didn't argue or shout. I didn't demand they leave. I simply waited, quietly calculating. I had something better than anger. I had the law, the deed, and a plan that would make their little mountain dream collapse overnight. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge doesn't come from rage. It comes from letting people trap themselves while you just close the door behind them. I spent the next 24 hours moving like a man who'd finally remembered he owned his own life. I called my lawyer under the pretense of needing routine paperwork done for the lodge, a name change on the trust, a clarification of tenant rights so I could rent it out seasonally, and watch the way the room fell silent at the other end of the line when I used his name, the way my words made the man on the other end sit up straighter. I didn't tell Jason I'd called anyone. I didn't threaten. I simply arranged for the deeds and the locks to be reviewed, for a property manager I trusted to come by for an inspection, and for the utilities to be put back into my name with immediate effect. Small things, bureaucratic things, that would be invisible to people who believe possession is ownership and paperwork is a bother. They were invisible to greedy people by design. I drove into town as if nothing had happened, stopped for groceries, picked up a new set of keys stamped with a number I knew would matter later, and let my face relax into the pleasant look of a man who's going for a quiet weekend alone. They watched me from the couch, smiling, as if the scene were complete, as if I'd taken my ease from their courtesy. They had no idea the plan didn't require fury. It only required patience and the instruments other people had taught me to use: law, title, and a little theatrical timing. When the property manager arrived under the pretense of measuring shutters and checking the chimney, I greeted him at the door with the kind of warm old man smile that hides a ledger of grudges. He did his check, made notes, and then, casually, as if mentioning weather, he asked to see the lodge's rental agreements to make sure everything is in order. I watched Erica's mouth draw thin as she realized there were formalities she'd never bothered to learn. Jason stammered excuses about clearing things with Dad, the way a child invents reasons for breaking a vase. They had been living here 6 weeks as if this were a vacation house they'd earned. They'd brought their furniture, their framed pictures, laundry left in baskets. But in the eyes of law and contract, they were, at best, guests. The property manager smiled kindly and said the one sentence that carried the thunder. "There's no lease in our file under your names." The color drained from Erica's face a degree at a time. Jason's jaw worked. They had presumed ignoring paperwork meant ignoring consequence. The world I'd built for them had taught them the opposite. I let them stew in that small, cold terror for the duration of the afternoon while I went about the slow, quiet work of undoing the illusion they'd wrapped themselves in. The locks were changed that evening, not as a melodramatic gesture, but as a first domino, a practical, inevitable consequence. The new keys sat like mute witnesses on my bedside table. I called the utility companies to correct the account names and had the cable suspended, a necessary inconvenience that would make their stay increasingly uncomfortable and impossible to justify. My lawyer drafted a short letter, all formal calm, that outlined a 30-day notice to vacate because the lodge was being restored for family use and a confidential inspection had revealed alterations that needed to be reversed. The letter used legal language that sounded kind and implacable at once. It was delivered the next morning with a polite knock. I watched them read it, watched the arrogance drain from their postures until they looked smaller than the luggage stacked by the door. People tend to imagine revenge as fireworks. They don't picture the low, unshowy administrative blows that empty a house. The reversal of direct deposit privileges, the suspension of their credit line attached casually to my account, because I'd never bothered to update beneficiary forms since I'd meant to teach Jason how to handle his own affairs. The discreet call to his employer about the way he'd misrepresented his income on that little loan application I'd accidentally discovered when I was shredding old bank statements. Each small, legal correction tightened like a belt around the careless life they'd parachuted into. They came to me, of course, pleading, apologizing, promising. They tried bargaining with tears, with faux contrition, with the old manipulations. "We thought you wouldn't mind. We needed a place while we got on our feet." Those words, rehearsed and cheap, tumbled out like confessions without courage. I listened. I let them say everything. It took less time than you'd think for the truth to come out. Erica's family had pressed Jason for social security numbers and deed information the way vultures press a kill. They'd planned to work the lodge into a rental scheme they'd never bothered to run honestly. The final punchline of their admission, the one that had Nigel and Erica laughing about antiques and rental contracts, was that they'd never expected me to arrive that weekend. They were counting on me being absent, patient, pliable. They'd misread my silence for weakness, and that mistake, I knew, would be their undoing. I could have dragged them through court. I could have humiliated them publicly with motions and filings, forced their confession into headlines and small-town gossip. But revenge, I'd long ago learned, tastes bitter if you chew it too long. What I wanted was a lesson that would stick, not a spectacle that would fade. So I did the strategic thing. I offered them a way out that required them to earn it, not plead for it. I proposed a conditional agreement. They could stay if they signed a temporary stewardship contract to manage the lodge as a legitimate rental business for 12 months, subject to audits, with every dollar accounted for, and a clause that allowed me to terminate if they lied once. It read like manna to a man who wanted to keep what was easy. To Erica and her mother it sounded like redemption. They signed without reading, eyes bright with relief. They'd fallen for the oldest trick of all, the belief that if a rule is generous enough, it won't be enforced. The audits began almost immediately. I hired a discreet accountant to visit unpredictably and check ledgers, to ask questions about bookings and subcontractors, to verify that the cottage linens had been bought and not borrowed from my storeroom. I visited under the guise of concerned ownership, a grandfatherly man who liked to see the place he loved kept tidy. I watched the in-laws mark down towels as loss on paperwork, saw them inflate bills for repairs they never performed, and I watched Jason sign them without reading. The ledger became a confession. We had everything we needed: receipts that didn't match invoices, guests who'd never stayed, repairmen who reported on call never answered. Each mismatch was another small, undeniable proof that they were running a scam, and proof, when shown to a judge, is the most deadly weapon you can brandish. I sent the compiled files to my lawyer not with a bang, but with the cold, patient certainty of a man who understands exact numbers will tell truths no temper can deny. When the papers were filed, the reaction was a mixture of fury and humiliation. They accused me of betrayal, of setting a trap, of ruining their family. They called friends, leveraged relatives for bailouts, wrote frantic emails to banks. The town whispered, but the judge saw the receipts, the bank statements, the pattern of theft hidden in plain sight. The court ruled quickly. The temporary stewardship was terminated and the lodge was immediately repossessed. I had expected the legal victory to be sweet. It was salt on a wound they refused to treat. But before loss stripped them of the pretense, life had already dealt them consequences. Their mortgage threatened to foreclose because they'd maxed credit cards and used phantom rental income to qualify for loans they couldn't possibly pay. Friends who'd once praised their savvy drifted away when rumors of impropriety surfaced. Vanity evaporates under scrutiny. After the legal dust settled, and they were gone with only the clothes on their backs and the humiliation like a shadow at their heels, I had a choice. I could have sold the lodge to the highest bidder, used the cash to disappear to warmer climes, or kept it for myself like some stubborn relic of memory and grief. Instead, I walked into the very room where Erica had set her framed pictures and sat down by the old fireplace that had witnessed my happiest years. I thought of my wife's hands, the way she'd stir a pot and hum, the way she'd insist we leave room for strangers at our table. Revenge had brought a momentary satisfaction, yes, but what stayed with me was a hollowness I didn't want to teach the next generation. So I called the foundation I'd been funding quietly for years, the one that helped veterans adapt after service, and I made them an offer. The lodge would be converted into a retreat for those who needed quiet and repair. Couples from broken homes, widowers learning to live again, single parents on the edge, they would have that mountain for solace, not profiteering. The foundation accepted before I'd finished explaining. The paperwork went through the next week as neatly as the legal forms had. In the end, Jason and his in-laws lost more than a weekend. They lost access to a place where healing might have happened, but they also lost the right to call it home. When the town learned what I'd done, the gossip softened into something else: respect. People who'd seen me as a soft old man now saw the architecture of my quiet vengeance. Its bones built from law and integrity, its heart built from the refusal to let hatred define me. Months later, I stood by the lodge's new sign as the first group of veterans arrived, their faces tight with different kinds of pain. A woman approached me hesitantly. She'd been homeless for a season, a casualty of a marriage gone wrong. She told me she had nowhere left to go. I gave her my hand, shook it, and felt, absurdly and purely, that sweetness of justice morph into something warmer. This was the ending I wanted, not because it punished Jason into ruin. He had punished himself, but because it took something they tried to steal and used it to heal other people's scars. They tried to reach me after that. Phone calls from Jason that rang hollow, letters from Erica that read like apologies without backbone. I read them and kept them in a box. I voluntarily withheld the satisfaction of responding. If you want someone to learn, sometimes the most brutal kindness is not to return the call, but to live well enough that your silence becomes instruction. My son came by once, months later, and helped carry boxes at the lodge for no reason he could explain. There was no dramatic reconciliation that week, no tearful speech about mistakes. There was work, hauling wood, fixing a broken step, listening to an old vet tell a story about a lost brother. He stood exhausted and different at the end of the day, and I saw, finally, the man under his arrogance. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't ask for the lodge back. He merely asked if there was somewhere he could be useful. I told him there always is. When dawn came that winter, the lodge hummed with people not planning invasions or scheming for profit, but learning to sleep again. I sat on the porch with a cup of black coffee, and watched as my son moved through the yard, helping someone rescue a rusted bicycle into the back of a van bound for the center. Revenge had been a necessary teacher in the way of a surgeon's cut, precise, purposeful, and then steadying with sutures of kindness. I had set fires of consequence, yes, but I'd used the smoke to clear the air. The irony tasted like coffee and pine. The family who'd thought comfort meant entitlement had been forced to watch true comfort, the kind that comes from honest labor and shared sorrow. Walk in and settle where their greed would never allow it to grow. In the end, they were not destroyed by me. They were moved by the truth of their own choices, and that was a harder thing to recover from than any court sentence. They'd learned their lesson. I had too. Revenge had its place, but restoration, that was what I wanted to leave behind. As the months turned into a full year, I saw the mountain lodge transform from a symbol of betrayal into a sanctuary of redemption. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy. Every scar on those wooden beams, every broken hinge and cracked pane, reminded me of the people who once occupied it like thieves in the night. But slowly, with every visit from the veterans, with every child's laughter echoing through the halls, that bitterness began to fade into something almost sacred. The lodge became alive again, not because it was filled with wealth or luxury, but because it was filled with meaning. One night, as snow began to fall gently outside, I stood by the window and watched the reflection of the fire dance across the glass. My son, Jason, was sitting by the hearth, quietly mending a broken chair. He didn't know I was watching him, and maybe that's why it felt real. There was a stillness in him I hadn't seen since he was a boy, that small spark of decency buried deep under the years of greed and arrogance that Erica's family had nurtured. It was like watching a soul crawl back into its body. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence speaks louder than forgiveness ever could. He'd stopped calling himself a victim long ago. The lawsuits, the debt, the public humiliation, they had all stripped him of the illusion that he was owed anything. And when he showed up here again, he didn't ask for comfort or handouts. He asked for work. He split logs, helped with maintenance, and cooked for the guests without complaint. I paid him nothing, and he never asked for a dime. That was when I knew redemption wasn't about words. It was about action, consistency, humility. The kind of slow, quiet change that creeps in when a man finally learns what his own hands are worth. Erica, on the other hand, didn't come back. Not once. Word around town was that she tried to start over, but greed is a poison that doesn't let go easily. She and her family drifted from one scheme to another until they faded into the kind of obscurity that people earn through deceit. I didn't rejoice in her downfall. I pitied her. The world doesn't have to punish the wicked. They carry their punishment inside them. You can see it in the restless way they move, the emptiness in their smiles. It took me nearly 2 years before I could look at my son and see him again. Not the boy who betrayed me, not the man who took my home, but the child I'd once taught how to cast a fishing line, the one who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way back from the mountains. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same lodge where he'd broken my trust had become the place where we rebuilt it, brick by brick, through sweat and silence and shared purpose. One evening, as we sat outside on the porch, Jason handed me a small wooden box. "For you," he said, eyes downcast. Inside was a key, an exact replica of the one I'd taken from him years ago when I changed the locks. He'd carved the handle himself, etched with the initials of my late wife, his mother. "You don't have to give it back," he said. "I just wanted you to know I finally understand what it meant." That was the moment it came full circle. I realized that my revenge, quiet, deliberate, merciless, had never been about taking something back. It had been about restoring the truth. That love, respect, and family aren't things you can steal or inherit. They're things you earn. Jason learned that the hard way, and maybe I did too. As dawn broke that morning, the mountain air smelled of pine and new beginnings. The veterans were leaving after their retreat, shaking my hand, thanking me for giving them peace. Jason stood beside me, silent but present, his shoulders lighter than they'd ever been. The sun rose slowly, spilling light across the peaks like forgiveness spreading through the world. That was when I finally felt it, closure. Not the sharp satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet, steady peace that comes after justice is done and mercy has had its say. The kind of peace that doesn't roar, but whispers. I took a deep breath, looked out at the horizon, and said softly, "Welcome home, son." He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. His smile said everything. The lodge stood behind us, no longer a monument to betrayal, but a legacy rebuilt from ruin. And as I walked back inside, I thought of my wife again. I hoped, wherever she was proud, not of the revenge I'd carried out, but of the man I'd managed to become after it. Because sometimes, revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration. It's about making sure the truth is seen, even if it takes years of silence to prove it. And in that silence, finally, I found peace. The years rolled by quietly after that, marked not by grand gestures, but by the slow rhythm of healing. The mountain lodge became more than just a property. It turned into a living reminder that even broken things can find purpose again. The laughter of strangers filled its halls, people who had come burdened and left a little lighter. Sometimes I'd walk past the main fireplace and run my hand over the stones, feeling the warmth soak into my palm, remembering the nights I'd sat there alone when the world had felt small and cruel. But now, that same fire burned for others, for soldiers learning to smile again, for single parents rediscovering hope, for young men like my son who had once lost their way. It's strange how a place that once represented loss can become the center of redemption if you let time and intention do their quiet work. Jason stayed on longer than he'd planned. He became part of the fabric of the lodge, fixing pipes, painting walls, learning how to cook real meals for the guests instead of surviving on takeout and pride. He started mentoring some of the veterans who arrived in worse shape than he'd ever been, teaching them to chop wood, to restore furniture, to find purpose in work. I'd often catch him out by the lake at dawn, standing with his hands in his pockets, staring at the reflection of the mountains, as if trying to measure how far he'd come. He didn't talk much anymore, not about the past, not about the things he'd done. He didn't have to. Sometimes silence between two people who have hurt each other means more than 1,000 apologies. One winter evening, the snow came down thick, swallowing the trees in silence. We just finished preparing the lodge for another wave of guests when Jason poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed me one. He didn't speak for a while, just sat beside me as the wind howled outside. Then, with his eyes fixed on the fire, he said, "Dad, I used to think love was something people owed me. You, Mom, everyone. But now I get it. You only get what you give." His voice cracked slightly, the sound of a man still learning how to be honest. I didn't answer right away. I let the moment hang there, alive, heavy with meaning. Then I said, "It took me a long time to learn that too." He looked at me and nodded, like he understood more than he used to. After that night, I noticed how differently he carried himself, slower, steadier, with a quiet dignity that had been absent in his youth. He didn't chase approval anymore. He earned it in small, consistent ways. When the foundation offered him a permanent role as caretaker of the lodge, I saw something shift in him, not pride, but gratitude. He accepted it humbly, and when he shook my hand afterward, it was like closing a wound that had been open for years. People in town began to speak differently about me, too. The man they'd once pitted for being swindled by his own family was now seen as someone who'd turned betrayal into something meaningful. But I didn't do it for their praise. I did it because revenge, real revenge, isn't about crushing someone. It's about reclaiming what was taken from you, your dignity, your peace, your power, and rebuilding it so strongly that no one can ever touch it again. The lodge had given me that. It had given Jason that. And in the quiet hours when the guests were asleep and the only sound was the crackle of the fire, I could almost feel my wife there, smiling in the warmth, proud of how we'd found our way back. Now, every time I stand on that porch and watch the sunrise spill gold over the snow-covered peaks, I think about the strange journey that brought us here. The greed, the lies, the betrayal. All of it had been the storm we had to walk through to understand what peace truly meant. If someone told me years ago that I'd end up forgiving the very people who took everything from me, I'd have laughed in their face. But forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the last, most powerful act of strength. And in the end, it's what set me free. The mountain will outlive me. I know that now. Someday, Jason will run it on his own. Maybe he'll tell his children about the mistakes that nearly cost him everything, and about the father who taught him that justice and compassion can live in the same heart. And maybe they'll understand, in their own time, that true revenge isn't about ruin. It's about rebirth. Because nothing terrifies the people who wronged you more than watching you rebuild better than ever, without needing their apology. As I finish my coffee and listen to the world waking up outside, I whisper a quiet prayer of gratitude, not for what was lost, but for what was found through the wreckage. The snow keeps falling, soft and unhurried, blanketing the world in silence. For the first time in years, that silence feels like peace, not emptiness. I smile, turn back toward the fire, and think, yes, this is how it was always meant to end. As the years went on, the mountain lodge became the heartbeat of my later life, a place where time slowed down enough for me to see what truly mattered. It was strange how quickly the noise of bitterness faded once the walls were filled with purpose. The echo of my anger, the sting of betrayal, the sleepless nights replaying my son's words, they all dulled, worn smooth by the rhythm of work and the steady hum of healing that surrounded the place. Guests came and went, each leaving behind fragments of their stories, little reminders that pain and redemption often share the same room. I found myself listening more than speaking, watching more than reacting, because life has a way of teaching you that wisdom is rarely loud. It's quiet, patient, and observant, the same way the mountain listens to every storm and still stands. Jason, to my surprise, grew into the kind of man I had once hoped he'd be. There was no sudden transformation, no dramatic apology that healed everything. Instead, it was the daily work, the early mornings hauling firewood, fixing roofs, helping guests who needed a hand, that slowly rebuilt the bridge between us. It's strange how consistency can do what words cannot. He never mentioned his past mistakes, and I never brought them up again. The unspoken understanding between us was enough. Every act of effort on his part was a quiet apology, and every gesture of trust on mine was a quiet forgiveness. One day, I caught him laughing with a group of veterans near the lake, a deep, genuine laugh that reminded me of when he was 10 years old and used to chase trout with his bare hands. I stood there for a long while just watching, realizing that the son I thought I'd lost had never truly been gone. He'd just been buried under pride, and now, finally, he'd dug himself out. There were moments, of course, when I still felt the ghosts of the past. Sometimes at night, I'd walk the empty halls of the lodge and catch the faint echo of Erica's laughter, that sharp, artificial tone that used to make my skin crawl. The memory of her arrogance, of her sitting at my table in my wife's old chair, sipping wine she didn't pay for, still haunted me on occasion. But those ghosts had lost their teeth. They no longer hurt. They simply reminded me of how far I'd come. I didn't hate her anymore. In fact, I almost pitied her. People like Erica spend their whole lives trying to take what they didn't earn, never realizing that what they truly lack can't be stolen. Integrity, peace, self-respect. These things can only be built, not inherited. As for Jason, he began seeing someone new, a woman named Claire who volunteered at the lodge on weekends. She wasn't flashy or loud, just quietly kind, with the sort of eyes that see right through you without judgment. Watching them together, I saw the kind of partnership I'd once had with my wife, simple, unspoken, rooted in respect. It gave me hope that maybe the pain we'd all endured had finally served its purpose. When Jason told me one evening that he wanted to marry her, I didn't give him a long speech or a warning. I just nodded, smiled, and said, "Do it right this time." He understood exactly what I meant. The wedding was small, held on the lawn behind the lodge, surrounded by pines and laughter and the sound of the river running nearby. I stood off to the side, watching as my son exchanged vows, and for the first time in years, I felt my chest loosen. It wasn't pride I felt, not entirely. It was relief. Relief that the cycle of greed, arrogance, and entitlement had finally been broken. That he'd chosen differently this time. And as he and Claire walked hand in hand toward the reception, I could almost feel my wife beside me, whispering, "See? He finally found his way." Life after that settled into a peaceful rhythm. I began spending more time in the lodge's study, writing, not letters or ledgers, but reflections. About life, about choices, about how the worst moments can lead to the best lessons. Sometimes guests would find me there, pen in hand, and ask about the old photographs on the wall. I'd tell them pieces of the story, never the whole thing. Just enough to remind them that losing everything isn't the end. It's just the test that reveals who you really are. I'd tell them that revenge doesn't always have to be cruel. Sometimes it's simply reclaiming your peace and refusing to let bitterness own you. The years aged me, but gently. I grew older, slower, but lighter somehow, like a man who'd carried a heavy stone up the mountain only to realize he no longer needed it. Jason and Claire eventually took over the day-to-day running of the lodge. I let them, proudly, though I still kept my small cabin nearby. Some mornings I'd wake early, make coffee, and watch the sun rise through the mist, the same way I used to with my wife. I'd think about how easily things could have gone differently, how close I came to letting anger devour me whole. But instead, I'd chosen to build something out of the ashes. And that's the quiet truth about revenge, real revenge. It's not about seeing others suffer. It's about seeing yourself healed. It's about standing on the ruins they left you with and saying, I'm still here. Stronger, wiser, free. I'd learned that sometimes the best way to win isn't by fighting harder, but by refusing to be dragged down into their darkness. Let them live with the weight of what they did. You live with the peace of what you built. Now, when people visit the lodge, they see a cozy retreat surrounded by beauty. They don't see the ghosts it once held or the pain buried beneath its foundation. And that's fine. They don't need to. The mountain remembers for me. I just sit quietly, sip my coffee, and listen to the wind moving through the pines. There's no anger left, no resentment. Only the calm satisfaction of knowing that everything came full circle, that justice, in the end, found its own way. And as I look toward the peaks bathed in golden light, I whisper to myself the only truth I've ever needed to remember. Peace is the sweetest form of revenge. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the mountain winds hum softly through the trees, I sit by the fire and think about how fragile everything once seemed, how close I was to losing not just my home, but my sense of self. The betrayal that once felt like a death sentence had become my greatest teacher. There's something poetic about the way life breaks you down just enough to rebuild you differently. Not weaker, but sharper, quieter, wiser. I remember the night I first found them living in my lodge as if they owned it. Jason, my son, and that smug grin on his wife's face. The rage I felt then could have burned the world down. I was a man ready to destroy everything just to make a point. But in the end, I learned that fire only consumes, it never restores. What restores you is patience, discipline, and the slow, steady reclaiming of your dignity. Watching them walk out of that place, stripped of the entitlement they'd worn like armor, gave me a peace no outburst ever could. And as the years passed, I realized that life's greatest revenge is not proving someone wrong in anger. It's proving yourself right in silence. When Jason came back years later, humbled and remorseful, I saw in his eyes a reflection of the man I used to be, proud, stubborn, but now softened by loss. It wasn't words that mended us, but the quiet labor of time and shared purpose. Each nail we hammered, each tree we planted, each sunrise we watched without speaking, they were our apologies. The mountain had a way of washing the bitterness out of people, of making them earn their peace through work and reflection. There were days when we'd sit outside the lodge in silence, sipping black coffee as the morning fog rolled over the lake, and I'd think, this is what redemption looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and honest. I never reminded him of what he did. I didn't need to. He lived with that knowledge every day, and his actions spoke more loudly than any confession ever could. Years later, after I'd handed the lodge over to him and his new wife, Claire, I often caught myself walking the same paths I used to when I first bought the land. The pine needles underfoot, the sound of the river carving through the valley, the cry of distant eagles, they all felt like echoes of a life I had fought hard to protect. I'd sometimes stop by the old bench overlooking the cliffs, where I'd once sat and wondered if forgiveness was even possible. And I'd smile, because somehow, against every odd, it was. Jason had turned that lodge into something greater than I ever imagined. A sanctuary for families, veterans, and travelers looking for peace in a world that never stops taking. He honored the legacy I thought he'd thrown away. And in that, I found my own quiet victory. Now, in the calm of my twilight years, I understand something that took me decades to learn. That revenge isn't always destruction. Sometimes, it's transformation. It's refusing to let someone's betrayal define the rest of your life. It's building something beautiful on the ashes they left you with. until even the memory of their cruelty has no power left. I look at Jason and Claire now, happy, humble, grounded, and I know the cycle is broken. My wife would be proud. I can almost hear her voice in the whispering wind. You did right by him, even when he didn't deserve it. And that's the kind of justice that lasts, not the kind that punishes, but the kind that redeems. When I die, I don't want grand words carved into stone. I don't need monuments or memorials. All I want is for the mountain to remember me, the man who turned betrayal into peace, the father who chose rebuilding over revenge. Because if there's one truth I've learned in all my years, it's this. Time will always expose the false and honor the steadfast. And in the end, no inheritance, no fortune, no betrayal can outweigh the quiet power of a life lived with integrity. That is my legacy. That is my revenge. Sometimes, when twilight drapes itself across the mountains and the air hums with the low song of the forest, I sit on the porch of that same lodge and let the memories flood me. The anger, the heartbreak, the disbelief that my own flesh and blood could look me in the eyes and see nothing but a means to an end. I can still recall Jason's voice that day, sharp, impatient, soaked in entitlement, telling me that the lodge needed a younger owner, that it was time I moved on and let them make use of it. I remember the way my hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of betrayal. I had built that lodge with my bare hands, plank by plank, in the aftermath of losing my wife. It was my retreat, my memory of her, the place where her laughter still lingered in the wood. And yet there they were, Jason and his wife's family, sitting on my furniture, drinking my wine, living my life as though I had already been buried. That moment broke something in me, not just trust, but the illusion that love from your own blood is unconditional. But grief has a strange way of teaching you to sharpen your silence. I didn't throw them out that day. I let them think they had won. For months, I acted as if I had accepted it, as though I was some tired old man too weary to fight back. And in that silence, I watched. I learned. Every bill they didn't pay, every repair they ignored, every careless mistake they made, I kept record. Because the law may move slowly, but it moves with purpose when guided by patience. So, when the time came, and the sheriff's truck pulled into the drive, papers in hand, their faces went pale. My son's voice cracked as he demanded to know what I'd done. I told him simply, "You forgot who built this place." I just reminded the law. They left that day with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hollow echo of their arrogance fading behind them. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just sat in the empty lodge and listened to the wind through the rafters, feeling both hollowed out and free. It took time for the bitterness to fade. At first, I thought reclaiming the lodge would heal me, but what I didn't expect was how much the process of rebuilding it alone would change me. I fixed what they broke. I sanded down the floors, repaired the roof, polished the old banisters until they gleamed like they used to when my wife and I danced in the candlelight. And in those long, quiet nights, I found a new rhythm to my life, not one fueled by anger, but by peace. Funny thing is, revenge stops feeling sweet when you realize it's only half the journey. What really satisfies the soul is rebuilding something stronger than before, proof that their betrayal didn't destroy you, it refined you. Jason came back years later, looking older, smaller somehow. His voice carried shame I never thought I'd hear. He told me he'd lost nearly everything: his marriage, his pride, his sense of direction. I didn't rush to forgive him, but I didn't shut the door either. I saw something familiar in his eyes, the same kind of pain that once drove me. Maybe life had taught him the same hard lessons it had taught me. So, I gave him a chance, not because he deserved it, but because I was tired of carrying the weight of resentment. Together, we restored the lodge, and in doing so, we restored something of ourselves. Now, years later, as I watch my grandkids chase each other across the same wooden deck where my wife and I used to drink coffee, I realize that peace is the quietest form of revenge. It's the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't destroy, it just endures. Jason often thanks me for forgiving him, but I tell him the truth. It wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding. Sometimes, we all lose our way chasing what we think we deserve, only to find we've burned the bridge that led us home. But the beautiful thing about life is that some bridges, with enough humility and time, can be rebuilt. And as I sit here tonight, with the lodge glowing softly in the firelight, I know I didn't just reclaim a home. I reclaimed my peace, my purpose, and my family, all without losing myself to bitterness. That, more than anything, is the victory I'll carry to my last breath. And so, my story didn't end with fury or triumph, but with quiet understanding, the kind that only comes when you've walked through every shade of betrayal and still chosen peace. The lodge that once stood as a symbol of loss became my redemption, my sanctuary. The laughter that echoes through its halls now isn't forced or borrowed. It's real, it's mine, and it's filled with the voices of the family I nearly lost, and the man I once was before anger hardened my heart. Sometimes, life doesn't give you justice in a dramatic blaze. Sometimes, it hands you stillness, the kind that allows you to see everything clearly. Jason's betrayal once shattered me, but it also stripped away everything false, everything fragile, until all that remained was truth. He learned that greed builds walls that collapse under their own weight, and I learned that patience builds foundations that never crumble. Now, when the morning sun pours through the lodge windows and the mountains glow like embers, I feel her, my late wife, in the warmth of that light. It's as if she's whispering that I did right by our home, that forgiveness doesn't erase pain, but it makes room for something better. I smile at that thought, knowing she'd be proud. I often tell people this. Revenge may feel satisfying, but peace lasts longer. I didn't destroy Jason. Life did that for me. I simply built myself back up. And when he came home, broken and sincere, I gave him what he never gave me, grace. Because in the end, it wasn't about teaching him a lesson. It was about freeing myself from the chains of anger that had kept me prisoner. So now, when the wind moves through the pines outside and the fire crackles low, I raise a glass to the woman who built this dream with me, to the son who lost his way and found it again, and to the man I became because of it all. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was the silence of peace, a peace so complete, it speaks louder than any retribution ever could.